The autumn rain drummed softly against the kitchen window as Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. 3 months had passed since Henry's funeral, and the silence in their small house had grown so thick she could almost touch it. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking time that seemed to move both too slowly and too quickly all at once. She had been a good wife for 32 years, keeping their home warm and welcoming, cooking meals that Henry would praise with his gentle smile. Now, with no one to cook for, she found herself eating cold sandwiches over the sink, unable to muster the energy to set the table for one. The doorbell rang, cutting through her thoughts like a blade through butter. Margaret hesitated, smoothing down her gray hair. These days, visitors were rare. Most were well-meaning neighbors, offering casseroles she couldn't finish, their kind eyes filled with pity that made her chest tighten. She opened the door to find a man in his early 40s standing on her porch. His dark hair was slightly damp from the rain, and worry lines creased his forehead. Behind him, she glimpsed 2 children sitting in a blue sedan, their faces pressed against the fogged windows. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," the man said, his voice carrying a gentle southern accent. "I'm David Chen. I was told you might be looking for work as a cook." Margaret blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I haven't advertised for any position." David's shoulders sagged slightly. "Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store said you might be interested. She mentioned you were recently widowed, and that you were an excellent cook." He glanced back at his car, where the children waited. "I'm a single father. My wife passed away 8 months ago, and I'm struggling to manage everything. The kids barely eat the frozen dinners I heat up." The rain continued its gentle percussion on the porch roof. Margaret looked past David to the car, where a young girl with pigtails was drawing shapes on the steamed glass, while a smaller boy held what appeared to be a stuffed dinosaur. "How old are they?" Margaret heard herself asking. "Emma's 7, and Sam just turned 5. David's voice softened when he spoke their names. "I work long hours at the accounting firm, and my mother helps when she can." But, he trailed off, running a hand through his damp hair. "I know they miss having home-cooked meals. They miss having a mother's touch." Something stirred in Margaret's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. She thought of her own kitchen, with its unused pots and pans gathering dust, the dining table that hadn't hosted a proper meal since Henry's last birthday. "What exactly would you need?" she asked quietly. David's face brightened with hope. "Someone to cook dinner Monday through Friday. Maybe some meal prep for the weekends. I can pay well, and you'd be helping us more than you could know." Margaret glanced again at the children. The little boy had pressed his nose against the window, leaving a small circle of fog around it. Something about his innocent curiosity reminded her of the grandchildren she'd never had. "Would you like to come in from the rain?" she offered. "We could discuss this properly." David's relief was palpable. "That's very kind of you." He retrieved the children from the car, and they followed him up the porch steps like ducklings. Emma, the 7-year-old, had bright brown eyes and wore a pink raincoat that was slightly too big for her. Sam clutched his green dinosaur protectively, his thumb finding its way to his mouth as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Kids, this is Mrs. ... double quotes. David realized he didn't know her name. "Henderson," Margaret supplied. "Margaret Henderson. Mrs. Henderson might help us with cooking some real meals." David explained gently. Margaret led them to her living room, where Henry's favorite armchair still bore the impression of his form. The children sat carefully on the edge of the sofa, while David perched beside them. "What kind of food do you like?" Margaret asked the children, her voice naturally softening. Emma looked to her father for permission before answering. "I like spaghetti and meatballs. And pancakes." Sam removed his thumb from his mouth long enough to whisper, "Chicken nuggets." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "Those are excellent choices. I make very good spaghetti and meatballs." Over the next hour, they discussed practical matters. Margaret would come to their house each weekday at 4 o'clock, prepare dinner, and leave it ready for when David returned from work. She would also prepare some simple meals they could reheat on weekends. As they talked, Margaret noticed small details. Emma's shoelaces were tied in uneven bows. Sam's shirt had a small stain that suggested a hurried breakfast. David's wedding ring caught the lamplight when he gestured, and she realized he still wore it, just as she still wore hers. "There's one thing," David said as they prepared to leave. "The kids, they might be shy at first. It's been hard for them, adjusting to life without their mother." Margaret nodded, understanding more than he could know. Children need time and patience. The next Monday, Margaret arrived at the Chen house at precisely 4 o'clock. The white, colonial home was tidy but impersonal, as if the warmth had been carefully packed away. The kitchen was modern but underused, with takeout containers still in the trash and a coffee maker that clearly worked overtime. She began simply, with Emma's requested spaghetti and meatballs. As she worked, the children appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar sounds of someone actually cooking in their home. "Can I help?" Emma asked tentatively. Margaret glanced at the girl's hopeful face. "Do you know how to stir?" Emma nodded eagerly, and soon she was carefully stirring the sauce while Margaret shaped meatballs. Sam remained in the doorway, dinosaur in hand, watching with wide eyes. "What's your dinosaur's name?" Margaret asked him. "Rex," Sam whispered. "That's a very good name for a dinosaur." "Does Rex like spaghetti?" Sam considered this seriously. Maybe. By the time David arrived home at 6:30, the house smelled like garlic and herbs. The children had set the table without being asked, and Emma had even folded the napkins into careful triangles, the way her mother used to do. Margaret was putting on her coat when David walked in. His face transformed as he took in the scene. His children sitting expectantly at a properly set table, the warm smell of home cooking filling the air. "Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly, "I can't thank you enough." The children helped, Margaret replied, buttoning her coat. Emma is an excellent stirrer. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret found herself looking forward to her afternoons. At the Chen house, the children gradually warmed to her presence. Emma began sharing stories about school, while Sam started showing her his collection of dinosaurs, each with its own elaborate backstory. She learned that Emma loved to draw but was struggling with math. Sam was still having nightmares and often woke, asking for his mommy. David was doing his best, but Margaret could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of trying to be everything to his children. One Friday evening, as Margaret prepared to leave after making a batch of her famous chocolate chip cookies, Emma tugged on her sleeve. "Mrs. Henderson," the girl said softly, "will you come back Monday?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Good," Emma said. Then after a pause, "It feels like home when you're here." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She knelt down to Emma's level. "It feels like home to me too." That weekend, for the first time since Henry's death, Margaret found herself humming while she planned meals. She thought about Sam's preference for cut-up carrots over whole ones, and how Emma liked her sandwiches cut diagonally. She realized that somewhere in the rhythm of cooking and caring, her own heart had begun to heal. On Monday, she arrived to find a small drawing taped to the refrigerator. It showed 4 stick figures standing in front of a house, a man, a woman, and 2 children. In Emma's careful 7-year-old handwriting, it was labeled, "Our Family." Margaret stared at the drawing for a long moment. She had come to this house thinking she would simply be a cook, someone to prepare meals and leave. She hadn't expected to find herself needed in ways that went far beyond food. She hadn't expected to discover that a heart could break and mend at the same time. That evening, when David came home to find Sam helping Margaret make cookies while Emma did her homework at the kitchen table, he paused in the doorway. "You know," he said quietly to Margaret, "when I hired you, I thought we just needed a cook." Margaret looked around at the warm kitchen, at the children who had claimed pieces of her heart, at this man who was trying so hard to rebuild a life for his family. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we find exactly what we need, even when we didn't know we were looking for it." Outside, the autumn rain continued its gentle song, but inside, the house was filled with the sounds of a family learning to be whole. Again, Margaret Henderson had knocked on a door looking for work, never dreaming she would find a new purpose, and 2 children who would call her heart home.